Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for joining us for Onward's latest event, which is an in-conversation with our guest, Laura Trott, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. We're very pleased to be hosted today by in-house communications, and we're here to discuss our latest report, Lessons Learned, which is the product of a lot of hard work by our brilliant team, Gavin Rice and Lucia Goodwin. I think education represents, by some distance, the most impressive domestic reform legacy of the last Conservative government. And it's obviously right at the heart of so much political debate at the moment because of the government's schools bill. Sadly, it seems the government want to break with 2 decades of consensus on this issue. Clearly, the academies reform programme began under Tony Blair and Andrew Adonis, and it is something which I think they can be very proud of. It's something which clearly Michael Gove and Nick Gibb built upon over a long period at the DfE. Indeed, I think Nick Gibb's tenure at DfE was one of the all-time records in office, but it's something which yielded clear and spectacular results. And Laura and her shadow team, including the brilliant Neil O'Brien, have been doing an outstanding job of holding ministers to account and making sure that we unpack precisely why it is, I think, government should be so cautious about making big changes to an area where it seems to me the empirical evidence is so clear. It was in that spirit that we commissioned Lessons Learned as a report, precisely to make sure there is a reference point for what happened in education since the reform programme began some 20 years ago, to make sure that we get it down very clearly at the start of the Parliament where the government picks up and that, frankly, the responsibility that they have to make sure that that progress isn't lost. So, Laura, it's a real privilege to welcome you this morning. Thank you very much for being here and for giving your time.
Thank you for having me.
It's really great because this is something which On would want to do more of. These in-conversation events hopefully do allow us both to have a conversation about the issues that matter from Onward's point of view, but also to bring our audience into play. And we'll start with about a half-hour conversation between Laura and myself, and then I'll open the floor to questions. So please don't be shy when that time comes, because we do want to make sure this brings in as many people and as many perspectives as possible. Just before we begin, I think it's worth just recapping some of the statistics from the report, because they do speak to quite how transformational the legacy of education reform in this country has been. In every region, the share of schools rated good or outstanding by Ofsted has at least doubled over the last decade. Today, 89% of schools in England are rated good or outstanding, compared to just 68% in 2010. The disadvantage gap at both Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4 has fallen steadily. England has risen up the rankings in international tests, so we now rank 5th in the world for literacy and 6th in the world for science. The success of our education reforms is, of course, especially clear when you sadly compare it to Wales and Scotland, where the education system has been left essentially unreformed. I think that disparity is something which needs to be addressed, and in the context of the Wales and Scotland elections next year, ought to be a source of real challenge to the governments in Cardiff and Edinburgh. Indeed, in Wales today, the average student only performs as well as the most disadvantaged students in England, even when controlling for socio-economic background. That is a scandal, and it's something which ought to be a challenge to everyone in the Welsh education system. So, Laura, perhaps it's right to begin with your own reflections on this legacy. Is there a particular aspect of which you are most proud? And do you think there is a purpose to the schools bill which it's legitimately trying to address? Or is it purely an ideological piece of legislation?
Thank you, Simon. And first off, congratulations on an excellent report. It's a very timely report, and it's very, I think, important for us to remember exactly the extent of the reforms that were brought in by a previous Conservative and indeed coalition government, and the impact they had on children up and down the country. And this is an impact they had on children, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that is what we are all fighting for. And that is why I was so shocked, actually, when this bill appeared just before Christmas, because I've been Shadow Education Secretary for a matter of weeks. This is a job that I've always wanted to do. And I was expecting a bill about well-being. This was well-trailed by the government. They'd said before that they wanted to do something. Actually, many of the proposals that they talked about were ones that we supported in principle, although we will always scrutinise the detail. But for them to put forward something which abolished academies in all but name, so casually, without running a green paper beforehand, there was no white paper, there was no real mandate for most of this in their manifesto, just beggared belief. And it's just unbelievably reckless that they did this without thought for the consequences, without any evidence whatsoever that what they were going to put in there was going to make a single thing better. And in fact, in many cases, there's a lot of evidence that will make things worse. So that is why both Neil and I have been fighting so hard against this bill, because it really, really, really matters. And it's difficult sometimes to discuss why structures matter so much, because the Labour ministers will go on TV and say, what we want is a good school for every child. And you have to point out over and over and over again that that is what the existing structures that we have in place are helping to deliver. Now, of course, there are problems in our school systems, things that we need to be focusing on. But that is another reason why this bill is such a wasted opportunity, because we all know that there's limited time in government, there are limited resources, and this government are spending time on a bill which is nothing but ideological, a list of union demands that we know will make things worse and not better. And that is why we've been fighting it so hard.
Well, I think that point on structures is really important, because one of the observations I have as a former constituency MP is I've seen in practice the difference that the Academy's interventions can make in terms of driving up standards. So there's a secondary school in East Cleveland called Freeborough Academy, and I visited in 2018, shortly after I'd first been elected, and the conditions in the school were properly Grange Hill, and the incoming head would have said as much. So it's a big atrium type structure arranged around an open space with multiple floors, and we were literally conducting my visit with pupils running round during lessons, playing a game against the teachers effectively in terms of who could spend the most time out of class. And the school had just been inspected by Ofsted and found to be inadequate in every single category. It was taken over by the Northern Education Trust, which has a marvellous CEO called Rob Tarn, and that intervention within the space of 5 years totally transformed the school. It is now outstanding in all but one area, outstanding overall, and that is your classic white British, white working class community, an area where educational attainment is low, and the academy change that was made has totally transformed the life prospects of those kids.
And there are stories like these up and down the country. And this is why it was so offensive in trying to defend these reforms, which have rightly come under a huge amount of attack from not just us, from the Children's Commissioner, academy heads, head teachers up and down the country. The education said to me and to other shadow ministers to get out of London. And it was just extraordinary that she hadn't understood the depths of progress we made. Schools exactly like that, right? Schools exactly like that. And that is why we have to fight, because we know the best way of turning around a failing school is for it to be taken over by an excellent academy chain, right? That is the best way that we know. Now, that doesn't always work, but there is no other way which is proven to work any better. And that is the crucial, crucial, crucial thing. And so for them to just reverse that, one of the things that they're reversing in their bill, again, without any work done to prove that another approach would be more effective. And what they're doing is they're basically building in a delay. They're building in an 18-month delay for schools to be taken over. Why? What are they trying to solve here? This is what's been so frustrating fighting it, because there isn't an alternative that they're trying to argue. They just resort to personal attacks and insults when somebody tries to point out that actually what they're doing isn't the best thing and isn't in the best interest of children up and down the country. Look at what they did to Amanda Spillman this weekend. I mean, that was coming from Number 10. I cannot tell you how furious I am about it. To attack a ex-public servant who has spent her life trying to improve the lives of children up and down the country, for her to be abused in those terms by a spokesman from the Prime Minister is utterly unacceptable.
Yes, it felt like a very personal attack, I think, and went, if you like, far beyond the normal bounds of what's permissible. Beyond academisation, the bill also reduces freedoms over hiring non-QTS teachers. Now, this may sound like a bit of a niche issue, but freedoms over QTS are widely used in the highest performing academy chains. So in 2024, non-QTS teachers made up 9.2% of the Harris Federation Trust for Workforce, for example. In the Wembley Academy Trust, which is one of the most successful in the country, the rate was 22%. And I think there's a particular issue around non-QTS and SEN teaching where there's considerable workforce flexibility because of the niche requirements of that sector. Are you concerned about this change? And what would the Conservatives do were we to return to government to address it?
So this is a part of a wider move to take away academy freedoms, which is contained in the bill, which means they're essentially getting rid of academies in all but names, despite what they say about how academies are the bedrock of our school system, but yet they're abolishing everything that's made them successful. Again, qualified teacher status is one of the things that they like to go around and say, oh, every child should have a qualified teacher. Now, what they're overlooking there, of course, is that the majority of schools do have qualified teachers, and many teachers are working towards a qualified teacher status. But there are 16,000 who may have come in through alternative routes in things like PE, who they may be coaches previously. Catherine Berbel-Singh has talked about having recruits from the army who've gone on to be excellent teachers within her outstanding school that the Education Secretary refuses to visit. And I ask again, what problem are they trying to solve here? What is the big crisis with unqualified teachers that we've got up and down the country that they are solving with this bill? And why, at a time when we are struggling for teacher recruitment, would you make it more difficult for teachers to come in schools? And also, this bill is frankly quite badly drafted because within it, they are not clear that actually the 16,000 teachers that are existing in schools won't have to therefore get a qualification. They give lots of, they're in the guidance, they say this is going to be okay, but it's not clear on the face of the bill. And this is one of so many cases where they have just said, basically, trust us. And frankly, I don't.
Well, you mentioned poor drafting, and obviously you were able to score some important wins in the common stages, in particular around flexibility on pay, for example, and I think that was welcome. It's clearly now gone through third reading in the Commons. Do you think there's meaningful scope for further amendment in the Lords for improving the bill, or do you think that ship has sailed, really?
As long as this bill is in the Houses of Parliament, we will fight, and we will fight hard. And they haven't got a leg to stand on because they have not got any arguments. They cannot make an argument for what they're doing, which isn't just personal insults. Even, you saw Kemi at Prime Minister's Questions, has asked the Prime Minister on a couple of occasions for some evidence for what he is doing. He either talks about the safeguarding bits of the bill, which we all agree with, or he doesn't talk about anything at all. And that is the problem. So they've got the numbers, undoubtedly, in the House of Commons, but we have the right argument, which is why we're going to keep on making it, because it's too important not to.
And have you given thought, I appreciate 28, 29 is still a long way away, but is it the case that if the Conservatives return to government at the next election, you would make it your business to repeal a lot of this legislation, or is that still up for grabs? Is that still up for debate?
No, we'd absolutely repeal the relevant bits of this legislation. It's wrong. We know it's going to reduce standards in schools, and we know that it's disadvantaged children who it would hit the most. So therefore, this would be a priority for us to reverse it. Of course, there's much wider work going on our policy positions. You would have seen that Kemi set that process. And I'm very keen for people in this room who are obviously interested in education policy to be part of that process, because I do think it is really important. There are lots of issues within the schools that we need to address, but this bill is making everything worse.
No, marvellous. And Onward will obviously, here's our shameless plug, do our best to be part of that process of policy renewal. Turning to another area of policy, which obviously very much linked to the education scene, and the national insurance contribution increase, which is coming into effect next month, i.e. tomorrow. How worried are you, Laura, about the impact of the national insurance increase on schools and on employment specifically in terms of making good that shortfall? Because I think we've heard the government's compensation to the education sector for the NICS rise is likely to fall short by up to 35%, that will clearly put more pressure on school budgets.
I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole a bit with disastrous things that the Education Secretary is doing to our school system. This is one which is really problematic because they said to schools, ministers said to schools that they would compensate them for the national insurance rise, which is why it's come as such a shock to so many up and down the country that there are significant shortfalls. So, as you rightly point out, Simon, ASCA have said it's in the region of 15 to 35%, they think. Others are saying around 20%, but in every case, they're reporting shortfalls. This is a massive issue for schools who are already worried about what is going to happen with the pay award when that comes through properly and whether that will be funded. So they need to U-turn on this. They need to stay true to their word to compensate schools because that's what they said they were going to do. There are other areas, like nurseries, where they haven't said that they're going to compensate at all. That is causing its own problems. But they did say they were going to compensate schools. They've broken that promise. They need to address it. Otherwise, we're going to see some serious problems in our schools come September.
I think that certainly stands out as a clear promise, which, as you say, needs to be honoured. Do you have a particular strategy about how you're going to try and put pressure on them to do that?
I mean, run around to places like this and talk about it a lot is my main strategy. But what I'm trying to do is get as many head teachers talking about this as possible, because they are the people who do so much. They manage every single day with very tight budgets, with lots of things that the government throw at them. They are brilliant and they're doing such an incredible job. But this, they've said, they can't deal with. You know, there's nothing more they can do in order to help with this. So they are the people that I'm trying to get out as much as possible to talk about the impact that it's having on their schools and children's education.
Post-COVID, one of the big ongoing issues is absenteeism. And the statistics on this are pretty astonishing. A record 170,000 children missed at least half their classes in 2024. What do you think is the best strategy to pick up on that aspect of the pandemic legacy and how we can bear down on the absenteeism issue?
This is genuinely frightening, the trends in absences. I think it is the biggest issue facing the school system at the moment. And the reason why it is so important is because disadvantaged children are way overrepresented in the numbers of people who are off at the moment. This is what is driving the disadvantage gap in this country. We need to fix this. Children need to be back at school. That should be, if I was Education Secretary right now, this would be my absolute top priority, because once children fall out of the school system, getting them back in is really, really hard. Baroness Barron, who is wonderful, by the way, she was a schools minister. She's now, thankfully, still our shadow minister, and she's doing wonderful work in the Lords. She was working with schools on this. There are things that we know do work. I think sharing that expertise is really important. I also think local councils need to step up more here as well. From talking to schools, the threshold at which local councils get involved at the moment, I think, is too low, and we need to address it. But this is absolutely what needs to be focused on right now. We've had one speech, I think, saying it's important. There needs to be more work. We'd be willing to work with them on that because we need to fix this. Otherwise, the disadvantage gap is going to get worse, and the repercussions of that for this country will be huge. So this needs to be sorted out.
One of the things that struck me during the pandemic, representing what is a pretty deprived constituency, was the scale of the COVID impact on relative disadvantage. Because speaking to school leaders, when the curriculum moved substantially online, one of the most glaring disparities was that a home with multiple devices for say there's 2 or 3 children in a house, for them to log on to do their respective work was in a much better position than one where perhaps there was only one mobile phone to go round. And so whilst there was remedial work done in terms of getting laptops out and all the rest of it, no one should pretend that equality of access to education was the same during that spell. And I think that must still be an ongoing legacy issue for focus.
It absolutely is. And this is why we must never, ever, ever shut schools again unless there is a compelling health issue for children. I do not think that second shutdown of schools should have happened. I think the implications for children have been severe, that we are still looking at now. And we need to be absolutely clear about the effects that that has had. I hope that is something that the COVID inquiry will pick up upon. And it also, coming back to Amanda Spillman, she was one of the people who was very vocal at the time about keeping schools open. You know, she was doing that in the interest of children, when the unions, and by the way, the Labour Party, were pushing for them to be shut for longer. That was not in the interest of children. And we need to make sure that we have an institutional way of ensuring that exactly this impact that we talked about here is considered in more detail in the future, because I do not feel it was at the time. I wrote an article about this at the time when it was happening. Of course, COVID was a very difficult time for government. There were lots of decisions that needed to be made, and of course mistakes would have been made, but I think this is one where we need to ensure it never happens again.
I think in terms of the COVID inquiry, just to go on to that, because it interests me, it feels that based on some of the public evidence sessions, it has become quite, if you like, focused on who is to blame for what, rather than necessarily doing what I hoped it would do, which is to elucidate truths for future pandemic-like challenges. Rehashing who was doing what when in Whitehall is, in some ways, I think, to miss the point that it's the lessons which have ongoing applicability for the future.
I think that's spot on. I think that people within COVID were being asked to deal with an impossible situation where there was information paucity, and they were asked to make very difficult decisions. And of course, some of those will have been wrong, but they were done, I believe, with the best of intentions. What we need to do now is work out for the future what we should do differently. And I think that is the crucial thing. We need to know whether lockdown was effective or not. You know, whether it would have made any difference. Should it have been advisory? And in schools, I think for sure, we need to work out how we make sure the interests of children are at the forefront when those types of decisions are made, and the impact that it has on the disadvantage gap, as you so rightly mentioned, Simon, and that is still reverberating across the country now.
I think part of the pressure on schools, and this is something where we explore a bit in Lessons Learned, is that they obviously have to confront a lot of issues which go beyond strictly teaching and education. And there's always that question, I think, about whether we've got the balance right between the state and parents. So by way of unpacking that a bit, over half of teachers in the UK feel that they're seen as social workers by parents. A third of teachers report having to resolve family conflicts, and over a quarter have spent time preparing food for pupils. In that context, what do you think is the right focus of the system insofar as those wider goals which have become bolted on? And specifically, what are your thoughts on the government's £11 million supervised toothbrushing programme for schools? Because I have to say, whilst I get the importance of good tooth health, dental health more widely, that does concern me that it's moving the goalpost quite a long way from core academic attainment.
I think that teachers have done so much to pick up on other gaps in the system, because we know teachers will do anything for their pupils, and I think that is the crucial thing. And they've picked up so much because other bits of the system, frankly, have been a bit broken. If you look at going back to the pandemic, another thing that I hope that we will do is ensure in any future situation that social workers come out in person, right, which is what stopped happening in so many cases during the pandemic. And schools did pick that up. And schools are still picking up where social workers are not doing what they need to do. I've got a local head teacher who had a parent come to school at pick up on Friday who was clearly very, very drunk and wasn't able to pick up their child. He called social services, who didn't arrive for 3 or 4 hours. Right, so he was there.
Nowhere near responsible.
Yeah, exactly. He was there with the child, who he wouldn't release to the parents for obvious reasons. But that is what teachers are doing up and down the country at the moment, where social services are not doing what they need to do to support the schools. And so I think also we need to look at social services, how they are performing, because they have such a vital role in the system. And too many children at the moment, I think, are falling through the cracks. And now, of course, there are some amazing, incredible people involved in that at the moment. But look at the vacancy rates that we have. look at the number of temporary workers. There's a lot that needs to be done within the system to improve it. But I think that is why we are seeing teachers having to do these types of roles, because the wider system has some real challenges.
On the wider system, the government published the curriculum review last week, and I think I'd be interested in your thoughts on what that looks like, because I think there must be a concern that academic standards are liable to be reduced as part of that review. And we've already heard some quite, I think, worrying commentary around, all the sort of classic, we need a more holistic education. We need to focus a bit less on hard standards and teaching to the test, and all the familiar lines which I think we will remember from the sort of pre-2010 era. Will you be feeding into that review, and what will you be saying?
So, Simon, I think you and I share a real interest in social justice and the interest of disadvantaged young people. And that is why I am so worried about this curriculum review. One of the things that many people might not have noticed is that at the moment it's proposing to bring back coursework. Now, who does coursework benefit? Right? Parents who are there at home, helping their child with it, taking them through, helping them with the research on the computer that they're going to have, in there. And there's a reason that we got rid of it, right? And that is why it is just, I don't understand how they can possibly have an argument for reintroducing it again. And we know that this is something that will affect disadvantaged children. How on earth can they think that this is a positive way forward? So it's issues like these that are having to be refought again. And I'm afraid I am very worried, to your point, that soft bigotry of low expectations is back, right? We cannot be in a situation where we are not encouraging young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to be properly studying English and maths, right? And the key, we have to have high expectations for them. And this commentary around, it's too hard, it is great that we have a rigorous academic curriculum which is challenging, and we know when it's well taught can really deliver a complete transformation in life chances for young people. And anything that challenges that, I will oppose very, very strongly.
I can certainly testify to how challenging the curriculum is. I've got a 9-year-old, and Edward's maths homework is terrifying these days, and that's exactly as it should be. Yeah, exactly. Not that he would agree. On further education and skills, because that, one of the consistent challenges, I think, from employers is that perhaps one area where the last government didn't completely square the circle was on, if you like, future employability, making sure that people are work ready, particularly in more vocational fields. Do you have a sense of what next steps under a putative future Conservative government might be on the skills agenda in particular, and how we make sure that what is such a good academic legacy has a corresponding offer in FE and training and apprenticeships?
So I talked about whack-a-mole. This is another area where we've got some delightful proposals coming through from the government. So firstly, there's a bill going through the House of Commons at the moment that some people may not have noticed. It's called the IFATE bill. That's the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. It's abolishing that and setting up something called Skills England. Well, kind of. It's abolishing that and then not setting up Skills England and giving all the powers to the Secretary of State and then telling us to trust them at some stage they're going to set up Skills England, which again is an extraordinary approach to apprenticeships and technical education. They're getting rid in legislation of the role of employers in terms of how they're going to be required to be consulted as part of this. Again, we just have to trust them that they're going to involve them in the future. It's completely extraordinary. And then on top of that, they are threatening, we haven't got confirmation yet, that they're going to get rid of level 7 apprenticeships as well. So there's a huge amount which is happening, which is very negative in this space, which shows, I think, that there is just not parity of esteem where it comes to technical and vocational education and academic side of things. So that needs to be addressed and firmly addressed. I hold an apprenticeship fair in my constituency alongside other Conservative Kent MPs. We do it every year. We had 1,500 people coming through a couple of weeks ago, and it was incredible. Apprenticeships are amazing. They change people's lives. They are so widely available now. I think what we need to do is make sure that they're more widely available at 18, which I think is the key thing, because we know way more young people want to do an apprenticeship at that age than there is availability for. So that is something that we need to fix, I think. And also we need to look at what they're doing right now, because those level 7 apprenticeships, which take young people who maybe from, you know, a more working class background through things like law, can make a real difference to people's lives. And I can't see why they would just get rid of them.
No, I agree. And actually, I think on that parity of esteem point, one of the fairest challenges I've ever heard in this is that it's important when it's the true test of when apprenticeships will have parity of esteem is when middle class families will say that's as good as going to university. And it was posed to me as someone who is, you know, very, very, very much a middle class target person. Yes. You know, would you be happy for your kids to do an apprenticeship? I think that's really when. Yes. We've got to get to where I would unhesitatingly say yes, and actually the best apprenticeships I think do that.
Yes, and by the way, the private schools turned up at the apprenticeship fair, which is always the way you know. It's cutting through now, which is fantastic news.
You said at the outset, and this is my final question before we open to the floor, that this was a dream job for you, and I can well believe it, because it does feel that so much of the country's sort of future direction is set by what happens in the education brief. Were you to become Secretary of State, what would be your number one mission? What would you, if you like, judge as your marker for success in the role?
Disadvantage gap, without question. And that is driven at the moment primarily through absence, which needs to be sorted out urgently. Of course, we might be in a different place. I hope we're in a very different place in a few years' time, but that absolutely would be the thing that drives me.
I think that is a very positive answer on which to open up the room for questions. So Nicholas is at the back with the microphone, and he will roam seamlessly around at will. Laura, do you want me to pick out questions, or do you want to do it? Because I will serve as the compere for this. Sir at the back.
Hello, thank you for that. John Punter from Institute of Physics. It's about physics teacher recruitment, which has unfortunately consistently been missed for years and years and years, which has the biggest impact on young people from disadvantaged areas, which feeds into your last comment. I'm interested to hear your views on retention is important as recruitment, and what conservative policies are being formulated to deal with recruitment as well as retention of specialist physics teachers?
I think it's a really great question. I had, I think, 5 physics teachers in the course of my GCSEs, one of whom was a drunk who was wheeling around with a laser. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who say there are problems
Laura
with
used to be a lot taller.
I have a lot of sympathy for this particular issue. It is really vital. It's true of physics teachers. It's true across the board that there is more that we need to do. I think there is a real case for looking at public sector pay as a whole. This is not a policy announcement. This is just my personal position. I'd just like to point out before I get in trouble. Pay as a whole, and looking at how much teachers are paid versus, for example, train drivers. I think that there is more that needs to be done. I think the teachers are incredible. I think they do an incredible job. There is no more important role, in my view. And I think we do need to address this as a matter of urgency. And it's one of the things that I would be arguing for if I'm lucky enough to be in that role in a few years' time.
Marvellous. Yes, lady in the green dress.
Lucy Beresford. When you were discussing the toothbrushing initiative, you mentioned that the system was broken, and I think you might have been being a bit euphemistic there. I think basically parents are letting their own children down. They are taking their children out of school during term time to get cheaper holidays. They send their children to school apparently at the age of 5 in nappies. What will the Conservative government, the next Conservative government, do to rewrite that contract between parents and teachers? Because you quite rightly point out, teachers are now picking up the slack that parents really should be adopting.
It's something that I think we need to look at as part of the policy work that we're doing on an ongoing basis. There will always be issues with certain children and their why, you know, we've got special education needs, all the rest of these things. I think it's important that we take that into account. And I think it's also important not to blame parents for things. We know that doesn't really work. So I think working with parents on what needs to be done and making sure that it doesn't all fall on the school system, I think is absolutely vital. I haven't got all the answers here today, but you pick up on exactly the right thing I think that we need to be talking about, and we're going to be doing more on that as part of the policy work going forward.
Just to that point, we will have a programme of work called Reshaping the State here at Onward, which and I can see Eve in the front row, our head of research, smiling at the references. A part of that work will be around, if you like, what it is or is not legitimate for the state to be doing, and how we can try and, if you like, reset expectations. So if you like, we do clarify where families' role begins and ends relative to institutions like schools. Who's next? Yes, sir. Yes, you, sir.
Thank you very much. Don Williams, yes. Hello,
Hi,
Secretary of State. We were...
Shadow, sadly, at this
Sorry,
point.
sorry. I'm thinking forward. There will be an election soon and you'll be there. We were Camden councillors together for many years. And I'm a governor. I've been a governor of a primary school since 2002, right to the present. Yes, I did take 10 years out. But the problem of children not really readjusting to primary school or school in general from the time of COVID and lockdowns is still with us. I was in year 5 and year 6 not so long ago. Some kids can't last a day. Some kids are still unable to relate very well to their other colleagues in school. Yes, I better call them colleagues. I'm not sure if I use another word. I might be, it might be unsympathetic today's woke world. It's a problem. And I don't know what a government or what you would do to get them, because they can't learn this way. This is part of the reasons of absenteeism. They can't, people are, oh, it's John again, he's leaving school. His parents have come for him. He now has a stomach problem. Last week, it was a headache. Beforehand, etc., etc. But everybody knows that John, I'm sorry to use the word John, has a problem with relating to his colleagues. And it's really blocking education. It's really blocking my desire or his desire to go to school, etc. What can we do to help? Because that's creating all sorts of different problems.
Well, this is exactly what we talked about in terms of people who've fallen out of essentially the habit of going to school as part of COVID, and it's readdressing that now. I think firstly there's an expectation that we need to set that children are in school. One of the things I have noticed from talking to heads is there's often agreements about children coming in part-time. I don't think that's okay. I think we need to set an expectation that children are in school all the time. Now that is very difficult. It also comes down to some of the behaviour issues I think that we're seeing in schools at the moment. The government just scrapped behaviour hubs, which was a brilliant programme we know was working. And we know that behaviour issues are rising in schools. This is one of the ways that was successfully, things were being pushed through to help with that. There's no alternative that I've seen that they're pushing in its place. But that is something that we know, again, completely understandably for pupils, is putting people off where there is bad behaviour in schools. So it is a whole system approach. It's the expectation of children being in schools, more support from councils, help on the behaviour side of things, which I think is going to be made worse by the action that the government is taking on behaviour hubs.
Could I just come up for 1 second? Would summer school help?
Well, the Holiday Food and Activities Programme, I think, has been very effective. I think we do need to look at things like that and look at how these initiatives affect absence or not. But I do think, in principle, it is a helpful thing. Yes.
Yes, sir in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Luke Taylor from the CSJ. There's been a lot of talk about masculinity recently, especially with Gareth Southgate's lecture, adolescence coming out. And then within the think tank world, we released a report called Lost Boys, and Heppy did one on disadvantaged boys and education in particular. Just wondering, yourself and the wider Conservative Party, have you thought about what you might be able to do to kind of mitigate these issues, because that disadvantage gap in gender persists throughout. I mean, through disadvantaged peoples and non-disadvantaged peoples, it's still there.
I don't know if it's taboo to big up other think tanks when I'm at Onward, but it is such a great report.
What other think tanks?
But it is honestly a wonderful report that you did. And you identified a really important issue, which is that actually the underperformance areas that we're getting at the moment are coastal, white working class boys. It's a huge issue. And it's a huge issue for now and the future, for what that means. Boosting the attainment of schools in general is, I think, the thing that we need to do, because those areas are the areas where there tends to be poorer school performance. And I think we need to look at what we can do to get the really excellent academy chains in those types of environments, and what incentives that we can put in place to make that happen. I know one of the very many bad things that the schools bill does is get rid of education action areas and incentives for teachers to be part of that, which I think is really very wrong. But also, to your point about boys and what they see online, it's a wider point than my kind of brief as education secretary, but this is part of the reason I've been so passionate about making sure that we have a proper ban of smartphones from schools, because we know the degree of bullying which happens as a result of these devices, and we know what boys are seeing online, right? And we need to just take them out of the classroom, because they have a horrific effect on behaviour, attainment, concentration, all these things. And that is why it is so vital that we just get rid of them from school. They've got no place in school whatsoever. So I think a combination of all those things would help.
Yes, leaning out.
Thank you. Jack Lewis from the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. One of the major achievements in our books from the last government was the ability of DfE and DCMS to really sponsor the Duke of Edinburgh's Award and get us into more schools, but particularly some of the disadvantaged schools that Laura was talking about earlier. So I've got two questions. One of those was, if you were back in government, how would you work with us and others in the charity and third sector to boost access to enrichment activity? And also, would Laura like to visit a DfE delivering school in her Sevenoaks constituency?
That was neatly done.
Well, thank you. DfE is amazing. I'm afraid I only did bronze, but that was difficult enough. But I do think that you do such amazing work for young people up and down the country. And it is the types of experiences that you have at DfE that you wouldn't necessarily get elsewhere. And it's exactly those types of things which I think are so important, and why your aim of getting this into schools that wouldn't necessarily do it is so vital. And I would love to support that any way I can.
Marvellous. I noted the gentleman in front also wanted to ask a question, so for neatness' sake.
Thank you. Oliver Dean, Hayek Society. So my mum is a teaching assistant at a secondary school, and before COVID, the amount of students going into exams using things like word processors, in a yearly cohort, it would be about 2 or 3 people. Now, since COVID, that's gone up to about 20 to 30. Thinking forward to the next possible Conservative government in 2029, these numbers are only going to continue to increase, because the students who have gone through primary school and receiving these basic levels in English and maths are going to be coming through into the secondary school and going into doing GCSEs. What can you offer as a Conservative government to say to these students who are going to be having these struggles when they go into their exams, the support that they can receive from schooling and from the government more generally?
I think it's interesting. The use of ed tech, I think, is something that needs to be examined in a lot more detail. We have emerging evidence about how children learn, and that children learn differently if they're writing versus they're typing. And I think there has been a shift towards screen-based education that I think needs to be examined in more detail. Pearson, for example, I believe are going fully online in terms of their exams in a number of years. And I don't think we've really talked about whether that is,
I didn't know that. That's
that
incredible.
is the right thing for children, and whether what that does for learning. And so I think that this is a very interesting area, and one which is worthy of a lot more academic research on the impact that it's having. And then more broadly, if you look at the number of children who are having extra time, for example, on exams at the moment, it's getting to be quite chunky, to the extent to which you think, well, that's then palpably not fair for the other people who are going through. So again, these are not easy or straightforward areas, but it's important that we are asking the questions and looking at whether our system as it stands is fair.
Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Sahil Shah. AI capabilities are moving quicker than they ever have, and the world of work is changing quicker than it ever has. The extent to which it's difficult to predict where it might be in 10 years' time, where 11-year-old children might enter it. In light of this, how would you suggest sort of shifting, curriculum reform? So I guess students can both work with AI, but with an awareness of, in those timeframes, what AI may be able to do better than humans.
Thank you. I think this is a really interesting area. I have a general approach to what I think about the curriculum, which is backed up by evidence, which is that essentially you need to teach children knowledge, and that is the best way of them then attaining skills later. What has been seen in the evidence that I've read is that a skills-based curriculum is actually not very good at teaching those children skills at all, right? Which is what we've seen in Scotland, in Wales, and other areas. But your point around AI, I think, is really important. This is going to change the way that we approach many public services. And so we need to look at AI, I think, particularly for teacher workload and what it could potentially do in and around that. And then also look at the jobs of the future, as we should always be doing, and then examining whether schools are producing people who are set up for that. But like I said, my starting point is that a knowledge-based curriculum is the best way to prepare young people for the knowledge that they need to then get the skills for work.
Meg from the New Schools Network.
Hello, thank you. Meg Palchana from the New Schools Network. You have gone over quite a few of the issues in the bill which cause concern. One of the things that is concerning to me is we talk about good schools, but there is a clause in the bill about place planning and empowering the schools adjudicator to basically just decide whether or not, what level a school's entry level should be set at. That is something that has concerned many school leaders, but it's also written in quite a techie way and is a really difficult thing to understand. I think it's something that could be quite powerful if we're able to explain it to parents about what this might mean for their local area. And I was just wondering whether or not you could do that for the people here and make them realise what this power will do and how we should be making people aware of it.
You're so right. It is a really invidious clause in this awful bill, which essentially says that if you are a good school, you're no longer able to automatically expand, and indeed the local authority can make your school smaller. And as with so much of this, it undermines our approach to school improvement that has worked so effectively over the past few decades, which is choice, freedom, backed up by rigorous accountability. And what this will mean is that there is no longer the parent power of a school being oversubscribed, able to expand, and then nearby schools seeing their roles drop, and therefore clearly knowing that there is something that they need to do to improve. In this clause, and it's one of those things, it seems so benign. Oh, of course we need place planning at a local authority level. But what it does is it means that you are undermining what parents want for their children. And we had a vote on this in the House of Commons, making exactly these arguments. It was then followed up by an interview in the Evening Standard, whereby the Education Secretary denied that this is what the bill actually did, which is very frustrating because it's written there in black and white. And you are absolutely right. And what we're trying to do as part of this is to really raise awareness, which is why I'm very grateful for this question. And there is more that we will try and do on exactly this topic, because it is so vital that parents know that the school that they might have got their eldest child into, they might not be able to get their youngest child into, because the PAN, which is the number of children in the school, would have been made smaller.
Lady in the blue jacket.
Thank you. Tiffany Beck, PLMR and Chair of an Academy Trust in the Southeast. What are your thoughts on the accountability measures currently under consultation, like the Ofsted report cards and the Department for Education's RISE teams and their potential impact on school improvement?
Great question. I think that the accountability measures please no one. I am a big fan of the clarity of Ofsted reforms as they're currently constituted. We know that one of the many disastrous things they've done in Wales is get rid of the single word judgments, and that is a part of the policy package in Wales that the IFS have said has led to such disastrous outcomes, as Simon outlined right at the beginning. Disadvantaged children in England do as well as the average in Wales. So I have serious concerns about what this will mean and about whether it will deliver on better accountability for schools. Because to the point that I just made to Meg, a rigorous accountability system is what we know drives up standards. Now, of course, we've got to do that in concert with school leaders. We've got to make sure it's effective. But these changes, I can't see pleasing anyone, and I do think they need to look at them again.
Gentleman at the front, you had your hand up.
Yes, one thing we've seen consistently with Labour
Margaret.
in opposition was what they refer to as rebalancing and use the H word, holistic, which, having watched policy for many years, I've seen that this is always, and without exception, reducing the amount of science and maths that children are taught and increasing the amount of arts. I've never in my life seen a programme to get more science into arts curriculum, whereas the other happens all the time. And particularly, this affects young girls, women. They get pushed into careers where they could have had a far wider choice if only the curriculum allowed them to. And I can bring up any number of instances of girls specifically being told not to do science by their teachers. That seems to be largely driven by the unions. Because most, isn't it something like 87% of all teachers have no science education? And presumably, do you see the Labour Party softening the science curriculum to amplify the arts curriculum? Is that happening yet?
Well, there's always a place for the arts, but we've been clear that an academic curriculum which makes sure that we do have a large amount of science in there is the best way to prepare children for later in the workforce, to prepare them for life, and to reduce the disadvantage gap. And that's why I've been so worried about the curriculum reforms which have been in place, because it's all very well talking about adding things into the curriculum, but the crucial point is always, what are you going to take out? And actually, the drive forward in STEM subjects has been something which has been very effective in recent years. There are absolutely problems, which we discussed earlier, about teacher recruitment, particularly in science subjects. We need to address those. But the way to do that is not to take science out of the curriculum, it's to make sure that we're getting more brilliant teachers in to teach it.
Thank you.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, thank you. Ryan Frost from the Sutton Trust. My question's about attendance again, because you recognised it as a #1 priority and a major driver of the disadvantage gap. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on the use of incentives and reward systems for driving up attendance, and how this compares with the use of, say, fines and other punitive measures, because I think it was presented recently in some of the press as kind of a soft touch of handing out iPads or other things to sort of drive up attendance. So I was wondering, what your thoughts were and what might happen for a Conservative policy review on this.
Well, firstly, you will know I was a Sutton Trust girl, and I am so grateful for the work of your charity and all that you do to drive children from underprivileged backgrounds into amazing university careers. I think you are wonderful. So on that specifically, I think that we should be looking at what works. I think that this is such a huge issue that I think if a school is piloting a programme and it's really effective, let's do more of it. I don't really care what it is. Like, just get kids into school, make sure they're in school, make sure they stay in school. that is the thing that is really vital right now. And so I am not ideological about this. I just want children back in school. And that is my kind of clear message to everybody. And I think that there are some schools who are doing amazing things. I was talking to a head teacher just last week who sends, again, this is just an example of schools picking up where other parts of the system has failed, right? They send people out in a bus to go around and collect children from their homes where they're not coming into school, right? And it's working. So that is fantastic. We need to be making sure that approaches that are working are funded, that they're supported with this, and that local councils playing their part where they need to. So it doesn't, as ever, all just hang on schools. But there's so much good work that is going on at the moment. I think the sharing of expertise and what is working is absolutely crucial, and we need to be doing more of that.
One final question, gentleman with his hand up there.
Hi, thanks. I'm Ryan from Teach First. It's great to hear your emphasis on the disadvantage gap, and you rightly mention attendance as part of that. I was wondering what your reflections are on the challenges of child poverty more broadly, and what levers you think are there for us to address some of the challenges that come with that, whether that's the child benefit or pupil premium, uprating pupil premium, things like that, what your thoughts are on those.
Well, I think as Education Secretary, my primary focus with this needs to be the tools that we need to get children out of poverty later in their lives, right? And that is an excellent education. And that is what I think my singular focus would be. Because if you take that child from an impoverished background, give them a wonderful education where they're given every opportunity in life and the support surrounding them, that has got to be what will make the most difference to their lives. Now, on top of that, you obviously have the things that are in place in schools, like the holiday activity and food programme, which I think have been very successful in helping in the school holiday period with some of the issues that you addressed there. I'm keen to look at the evaluation of those. I think there's been some initial evaluation which has been very positive. I think we should see more of that and then look at what more we could do with that programme as a result.
Marvellous. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. I think, Laura, you mentioned earlier the importance of single word judgment. So let me simply offer one up, which is outstanding, because your passion for education has shone through today. I think you're right to characterise it as a moral mission, as well as, if you like, a wider societal one. And I think the importance of your work can hardly be overstated in terms of holding the government to account to make sure that the very strong legacy of successive administrations in driving reform of education isn't lost. And so we all here wish you the very best of luck with that. Can I please just thank you all for attending and ask you to express your thanks